Alright, hello everybody, and welcome to the second part of the video as promised about Oversteer, which is going to deal with braking. So the first part obviously was talking about managing the car oversteer on the throttle. This is going to talk about managing oversteer on the brakes. Okay, so obviously we know, anybody who's driven this car for half a moment knows that it loves to understeer. Okay, so you're going to get the car naturally understeering into the corners, and you're going to get the car naturally oversteering into the corners, but out of the corners, sorry, when you get on the throttle. But the obviously what we want to do, and what we can't entirely tune out with the setup, also I found, is getting really nice turn in. Like, look at that! Look at all that understeer. So how do we manage this in the car? How do we get turn in without spinning out? And we're going to be talking about that today. And basically what that's is going to do is we're going to talk about some more advanced, or what I'd like to think is a bit more advanced braking techniques. So first of all, what you need to know is if you go into a corner too hot in this car, what you don't want to do is gear down early. If you need to be super hard on the brakes, don't gear down. That will immediately lock up your back wheels, and you're going to overshoot the corner. So if you do find yourself missing your brake marker slightly, first thing to do is don't gear down and get on the brakes very hard. You're going to have a much better chance of slowing the car down without gearing down. Okay, so now we got that out the way. Let's talk using the brakes to our advantage. Okay, so what I just said about gearing down and locking up the rear is very, very useful actually. So if we time things correctly and we shift down a gear very slightly early, what that can help us do is lock the rear slightly, and that will cause the car to want, or the rear of the car to want to overtake the front of the car, which gives us some delicious oversteer for helping us turn into the corner. Now this is something that you manage. It's something, a bit of a feel that you need to learn, but it is something, a technique that can definitely help you gain an awful lot of lap time. So this is a perfect example of a corner where it's useful, and I don't do it perfectly here, but let's just have a look at what I did there. So this is kind of basic principles. So if we just slow this down, so when you see me get on the brakes here, so I'm on the brakes almost full. When I gear down slightly early, still on the brakes, and this locks up the rear, and you can see there, the rear is now locked up, and any input, as soon as you do this, any input that you give on the steering is going to be exacerbated quite heavily. It's going to give quite a big pendulum effect. So if you imagine a perfect environment where you're perfectly straight, and the road is perfectly flat, and there's no wind, and all of those kind of things. If you gear down slightly early, you will just lock the rear, and you'll go in a perfectly straight line. As soon as you apply any kind of steering input to that, it'll immediately introduce that pendulum effect. So what we're trying to do is get the car braking in a nice straight line, gear down very slightly early, and then a little bit like when you go through a fast corner flat on the power, by modulating the throttle to get the car turning, you can do the same thing on the brakes. So instead of using the throttle, in this case we're using the steering, by using a bit of steering input, we're going to be balancing the car going through the corner, or certainly lining it up on entry of the corner. So here you can see what I'm doing is I've already got the car turning in, but I've done it quite badly, and now I'm having to deal with all this understeer. So let's find ourselves a better example. But that is the theory. Okay, so here's another corner that's typically a very good example of this. So we'll brake just before the board over here. So there we go. Look how hard we are on the brakes in fourth gear. Now we've come off the brakes a bit to to gear down, because you don't, when you're doing this, you don't want to be full on the brakes and gearing down. If you do that, you will lock up, you will spin out, and you won't brake as effectively as you could. So braking, immediately managing the car. So the car is now turning in, but I'm immediately putting on some counter steer. And there we get our turn in, and we'll get back on the power. So let's fast forward to laps that I'm going to be doing a bit better. Let's go to turn 1. Okay, so turn 1, hard on the power, waiting for our braking marker, which is going to be about over here. There we go, on the brakes, full on the brakes, coming off the brakes to gear down. We're now in a straight line, so the car wants to turn, but we're in a straight line. We're now managing it. We've got the pendulum effect to help us out. Using the brakes to just modulate everything a little bit. Get that turn in that we want. Back on the power. So now what we're doing is we're getting back on the power because we're experiencing understeer. So as soon as we start experiencing understeer, we can get on the power pretty heavily, because that's going to then start spinning up the rears, overcoming the very limited traction these vintage tires give us, and it'll give us that oversteer on exit. Here it comes. There it is. And now we use our balancing technique to power out the corner. Let's go to the next instance this might happen. Okay, here we go. So on the brakes, gearing down, just getting the car unsettled, back on the power, and off we go. It's quite a subtle thing. It's more in the feel than it is in the visual. You will notice and hear, sound is going to play a huge part of this, where you can hear the rears just start to lock up. They almost start to chirp at you. Down a gear, managing that. There we go, managing on the power, keeping it nice and tight, and off we go on the exit. That's quite a good example of it, in fact. So we're on the brakes, we've got the car turned in, but we've got the car turned in too much, so we're now using the steering to manage that angle. It's a bit of a reverse of what we do with the power. So again, your steering is kind of a bit of a general guide for the car, and then now I'm using the brakes as more of a finesse tool to help me get the exact angle that I'm looking for. So you can almost think of it as brakes and throttle are the identical thing, except throttle you use on exit and brakes you use on entrance. So steering, always getting the car in the direction that you're aiming for, and then your brakes on entry help you modulate and get the right degree of turn-in, and then on exit, your throttle helps you get the right angle to exit the corner. So I hope that's helped. That's part 2. We'll see you again for another video soon.